Good morning, all. Today I'm going to discuss Linux operating system in detail in topic name introduction, and the subject code is 1935. So first of all, if we are talking about objectives of Linux operating system, so there are a lot of objectives of Linux operating system. So upon completion of this chapter, you will be able to answer the following questions. First, why are Linux skills essential for network security monitoring and investigation? This is very important point. How do you use the Linux shell to manipulate text files? If you want to add some programs, if you want to write some text, if you want to add if you want to write any kind of C program like add two numbers, so you can simple type in different types of editors like Pico editor, VI editor, so you can easily manipulate text file also. Okay, so how do client server network function? So how do client send information to server and fetch the information and grab the messages or information through server? So network function. So this is the third objective of Linux operating system. Okay, so fourth objective is how does a Linux administrator locate and manipulate security log files? This is also very important line. So how do you manage the Linux file system and permission? So in this point, if you want to install any kind of software like if you want to install a MS Office, so you need to type a command, and you need to get permission from Linux operating system through sudo command. So we need permissions in Linux file system operation. Okay, so next point is your what are the basic components of the Linux GUI? So GUI stands for graphical user interface. So where are what are the basic components of Linux operating system? So there are so many components of Linux operating system. Okay, I will tell you in detail in the next slides. Okay, so last objective is your what tools can you use to detect malware on a Linux host? So this is all about your objectives of Linux operating system. So I will tell you basically what is a Linux and Unix in simple definition. But so Linux provide basic and advanced concept of Linux, like our Linux is an open source operating system. So what is Linux? Why we called Linux is a open source operating system? If you want to copy or paste code from Google, you can easily use download your code of a Linux operating system. So that's why it is called open source operating system. So also it is like you can say Windows, Mac, Android, etc. So Linux or Unix, same, both are same, but different is Unix is also an operating system like Linux. Okay, so it is an a commercial operating system, you can say commercial operating system. So it consists of three parts. I'm talking about right now, I'm talking about Unix. Okay, so it consists of three parts. One is your kernel, second is your shell, and programs. I repeat, it consists of three parts: kernel, shell, and program. So most of the Unix and Linux commands are similar in nature. Okay, so if we are talking about introduction to Linux operating system, first, Linux is a one of popular version of Unix operating system. So it means it is a part of Unix operating system. Fine. Next point is here, it is open source as its source code is freely available. If you want to download or copy source code from Google, you can easily download it. Okay, and it's a freely available, free of cost. Okay, third point is your it is free to use. Okay, next is your Linux was designed considering Unix compatibility. So in this there are various kinds of commands in such as like directories, like files, like man pages, like file contents, like file permissions, shells, or VI editor. So various features are available in Linux operating system. So very important and very interesting subject. Okay. So last is your, its functionality list is quite similar to that of Unix. Basically, why we need operating system nowadays? So today Linux is in a great demand. Okay, so you can see the use of Linux everywhere. It's, you can say, dominating on our servers, desktop, of course in your smartphone also, and even used in some electrical devices also, like your in your home there is a refrigerators. So in your refrigerators, Linux is also available. So some people think Unix and Linux as a synonyms, but that's not true. Okay, many operating systems were developed to be like Unix, but none of them got the popularity as Linux. Right? It has several features similar to Unix, still have some key differences. So before Linux and Windows, computer world was dominating by Unix. Okay. So third slide is your components of Linux operating system. So Linux operating system has primarily three components. First is your kernel. Okay. Second is your system library. Third is your system utility. Okay. Kernel is very important part. It's very important. What is kernel? Okay. So basically, what is kernel? So Linux kernel is one of the core part of the operating system. So it establishes communication between devices and software. Like here, kernel is the core part of Linux, and it is responsible for all major activities of this operating system. So it consists of various modules, like it interacts directly with the underlying hardware. Okay, so it manages system resources also. It has four responsibility. I'm talking about kernel right now. So kernel is the core part of Linux. Basically, Linux has three primary components. One is your kernel, second is your system library, third is your system utility. Kernel is very important core part of the operating system. Okay, so it manages systems resources. It has four responsibility. First is your device management. Which one? Device management. Second is your memory management. Third is your process management. Fourth is your handling system calls. Okay, fine. If we are talking about device management, what is, I'm talking about device management in kernel. Next, memory management in kernel. Next, process management in kernel. Next, handling system calls in kernel. Okay. So what is device management in kernel? Very important. So a system has, you can say, many devices connected to it, like CPU. Okay. So like a CPU, a memory device, your sound cards, like your graphic cards, etc. So a kernel, what is the process of kernel? A kernel stores all the data related to all the devices. Fine. In the device driver. Without you can say, this kernel won't be able to control the devices. So thus kernel knows what a device can do and how to manipulate it. Okay, that's why device management in kernel is very important. In simple words, kernel um, handles all the devices. Okay, so that's why first component of kernel is device management. So second is your memory management. Okay, so memory management, this is your second part of a kernel. Another function that kernel has to manage is the memory management. Fine. So the kernel keeps track of the used and unused memory and make sure the processes should not manipulate data of each other using virtual memory addresses. Like in your memory, some spaces are available, some spaces are full, but in memory management, it is managed to all the track the record of the empty spaces and full spaces. Fine. So it makes sure that processes should not manipulate data of each other. So using virtual memory addresses. So right in your kernel, third point is your process management. Okay. So what is process management? So process management is your, you can say in process management, kernel assigns enough time to give priorities to process before handling CPU to other processes. I repeat, process management is the third point in your kernel. In the process management, kernel assigns enough time to and gives priority to processes before handling CPU to other processes. Fine. Last is your kernel. The fourth point, handling system calls. So handling system call is what? Handling system calls means a programmer can write a query or ask the kernel to perform a task. Okay. So second is your system library. This one, system library. So in kernel, there are four parts: device management, memory management, process management, handling system calls. Okay. So next is your system library. So what is system library? So system library program, the first of all, I will tell you the most well-known system library for Linux is GLIBC, like GNU-C library, well-known system libraries. Okay. So basically system libraries are special functions or programs using which application programs or system utilities assesses kernel features. So it means a kernel has to be triggered to perform a task, and this triggering is done by the applications. Okay. But application must know how to place a system calls, but because each kernel has a different set of system calls. So programmers have developed a standard library of procedure to communicate with the kernel. So like in your uh, college library, you can easily access your books. Okay. So in same case, in Linux, there is a system library. You can easily use them. Okay. So these library implement most of the functionalities of the operating system and do not require kernel modules code access rights. So you don't if you want to access library in your college, you can easily access your books. Okay. Same as in a system library. So in system utility programs are responsible to specialize individual level tasks. Okay. So this is about components of Linux operating system. So these are the basic Linux operating system terminologies. You have to understand them. What is kernel, what is service, what is bootloader, what is file system. Okay. So what is kernel in simple line or in simple words? In one line, kernel is the software that acts as a brain in Linux. I repeat, kernel is the software that acts as a brain in Linux. It controls the hardware and hardware and software. Sorry, by mistake I have written hardware and hardware. So it controls software and hardware is able to interact with applications. So next is your service. What is service? So basically this is the operating system terminologies. So one second is your service. What is service? Service is a program that runs as a background process. So some examples are HTTPD, NFSD, NTPD, FTPD, and named. Third is your bootloader. So what is bootloader? Bootloader is nothing but is a program that boots the operation system, like your operating system. Operating system is your operation. Okay, it's a process. So examples of bootloader and grub and ISO Linux. So this is about bootloader. Okay. So last is your file system. A file system is a method for storing and organizing files in Linux. So examples are ext3, ext4, fat, ntfs, and btrfs. So how does Linux work? How does Linux work actually? I will tell you. Linux is a Unix like operating system, है ना? So, but it supports a range of hardware devices from phones to supercomputers. Like, so every Linux based operating system has the Linux kernel and set of software packages to manage hardware resources. Okay. So how to use Linux? So we can use Linux through an interactive user interface, as well as the uh, you can say from the terminal, like a command line interface, CUI, CLI. I'm not talking about GUI. In GUI in Windows operating system, but in the Linux operating system, that is your command line interface. So different you can say distributions have a slightly different user interface, but almost all the commands will have the same behavior of all the distributions. So to run Linux from the terminal, press the Control plus Alt plus T. If you listen, students, if you want to open the terminal, Linux terminal, I will tell you in the next slides or next session how to open terminal, how to write program, how to write codes. But if you want to run Linux from the terminal, press the Control plus Alt plus T keys. I repeat, Control plus Alt plus T keys, and to explore its functionality. Okay. Now, definition of Linux or Unix. First of all, I will tell you what is Unix. So Unix is a computer operating system which is capable of handling activities from multiple from multiple users at the same time. The development of Unix started around 1969 and AT&T's Bell Labs by Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. So this lecture or this tutorial gives a very good understanding on Unix. Okay. So basically, the Unix system is a set of programs. Okay. The Unix operating system is a set of programs that acts as a link between the computer and the user. This line is very important. The Unix operating system is a set of programs that acts as a link between the computer and the user. The computer programs that allocate the system resources and coordinate all the details of the computer's internals is called the operating system or the kernel. Fine. So if we are talking about user communicate with the kernel, let us suppose user communicate with the kernel through a program known as the shell. What it mean? You can easily communicate with the kernel through program, but via shell. Shell is the intermediator between kernel and program. Basically, what is shell? What is shell? So let us suppose if if we are if I am communicate with computer and the user, so shell is the play important role. So the shell is the command line interpreter. The shell is a command line interpreter. So it translates commands entered by the user and converts them into a language that is understood by the kernel. Got it? I repeat, what is shell? Through shell, you can easily communicate with the kernel and the program easily. But what is shell actually? The shell is a command line interpreter. With the help of shell command line interpreter, you can easily translate commands entered by the user through your keyboard. Okay, it translates commands entered by the user and converts them into a language that is understood by the kernel. This is very important line. That's why again I am repeating, and converts them into a language that is understood by the kernel. Okay, so basically Unix was originally developed in 1969 by a group of AT&T's employees of Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, Douglas McElroy, and Joy Osana at Bell Labs. So there are various Unix variants available in the market, like Solaris Unix, ALX, HP Unix, and BSD are a few examples of Unix operating system. So Linux is also a favor of Unix, which is you can say freely available. Okay. If we are talking about a basic Linux operating system terminology or Unix terminology, so X Windows system. X Windows is your nothing but your desktop. Like X Windows system provide a standard toolkit and protocol to build you can say GUI, graphical user interface, okay, on nearly all Linux system. So second is your desktop environment. So what is desktop environment? Desktop environment is a GUI on top of operating system. So examples of GNOME, KDE, XFCE, and Fluxbux. So this is your desktop environment. So which type of desktop environments are available? So these are the environments available in the your Linux operating system, like GNOME. This is GNOME is a very popular desktop environment nowadays. Okay, various types of if we are talking about tools, you see various types of tools if we're talking about. So various types of system tools, development tools, and end user tools available in Linux operating system. Command line. What is command line? Command line is an interface for typing commands on top of operating system. Next is your shell. As I told, shell is an interpreter that interprets the command line inputs and instructs operating system to perform any necessary task and commands. Basically, when you type any kind of command in your terminal, Linux terminal, first of all, open terminal, type command, and just run the command, and it gives you result. So where you type the command? In your shell command line, shell command line. Okay, shell command line.